Okay, so my presentation is The Mental Health Plague in Capitalist Society, and it's by me. It's my name. And I ripped off my title from a quote I really like by one of my favorite authors, Mark Fisher, who I'll be talking about. I have his book in here. And I'll also be quoting from Tai Quinn from Preliminary Materials for the Theory of the Young Girl. And it's the mental health plague in capitalist societies, which suggests that instead of being the only social system that works, capitalism is inherently dysfunctional and the cost of it appearing to work is very high. And so I kind of want this to be a discussion. I don't want to talk the whole time, so if you guys have stuff to say, like, just say it while I'm talking. And yeah, so, and I'm also, there's going to be a lot of quotes and stuff because there's a lot more people who have more interesting thoughts than I do, so I like quotes and I like passages from what I read. And yeah, and then this is to whoever it would apply to. There's going to be suicide mention, abuse, violence mention, mental disorders that include as such, depression, schizophrenia, PTSD, possibly, etc., eating disorders, addiction, and drugs. And so for the first couple parts of this, I'm going to go over some data. And also, I just wanted to put it in there. It's going to seem really impersonal at the beginning, and I don't want that because I think this is a really personal issue to all of us. So I'm going to try and redeem myself at the end. So just bear with me. But the first stack of data I have is over a 12-month period, 27% of adults in the U.S. will experience some sort of mental health disorder, making the U.S. the country with the highest prevalence. Mental health disorders include mood disorders, anxiety disorders, attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, and substance abuse. Over one's entire lifetime, the average American has a 47.4% chance of having any kinds of mental health disorder, and that's from the World Health Organization. And this is just a chart, and for those who can't see, highest right now with people with depression, and this is taken from 2005 to 2006 in the US, 40 to 59-year-olds. It's really mostly prevalent in female, even though males have the highest rate of suicide, females are the most depressed. And then race and Hispanic origin, white is last in that. Non-Hispanic Black people have the highest depression rate, and second is Mexican American. And then this is the death rates for suicide. And so you can see it's really, really high, beginning of 1950s to 1960s across the board. And then it dips down about 2000, 2001 time, and then it's starting to skyrocket back up in 2010. So the first part, all age adjusted. So 1950s, you have 13.2%, and this is as per 100,000 resident population. And then it goes down in 2000 to 10.4, rises again 2004, 11, and as of 2010, 12.1. And if you go down to the male all ages, 21.2 in 1950s, goes down, goes down, goes down, goes up in 2004, and then it's back to almost the same 19.8 in 2010. And female, it's pretty static. It's there's not much difference between 1950 and 2010. And these are some just random information for you. So 61,500,000 of Americans diagnosed with a mental disorder in a given year. That's 1 in 4. And then we have, I think that's 100 trillion. I don't know, you do the math. And costs for untreated mental illness, unemployment, disability, substance abuse, etc. 800,000 deaths by suicide each year globally. 25% of people affected by mental illness feel like people are compassionate towards their disorder or towards mental illness in general. So that's only 1/4 of people who have it who feel people are compassionate towards it. 350 million globally affected with specifically by depression, and 40 million US citizens with an anxiety disorder.
That comes as no surprise to me.
Yeah, no, yeah, me being one of them. 3,500,000 Americans suffer from schizophrenia, and 60% of adults with a mental disorder did not receive treatment in 2012, which is a lot.
That's a really
it's really high. Yeah, that's more than half. So it's really crazy to think about.
Most of those people are actually like in jail and getting themselves into trouble because they're not getting treatment.
Exactly, and what's really interesting too is that a lot of jails are actually facilities for mental health patients, which is really sad. So, and then 20% of mothers polled by babysitters suffered from postpartum depression, and 40% of them did not seek medical treatment, just a little less than half. 11% of adolescents have a depressive disorder before the age of 18, which is really high, if you think about it. 11%. Yeah, and that's just in adolescents, which would be like 12 to 17, 12 to 15. Every 1 hour, seven Americans die by suicide. And then, let me see. And then something I wanted to talk about too is that I wanted to kind of point out how you don't see on the data any source for transgender or gender nonconforming peoples. And I think that's sad because I couldn't find a source by the US government or the US in general who accounted for them. And I don't know how people really expect the government to help them when they're not even recognizing them, that they exist. And so I found data by the Huffington Post and the Williams Institute, which is a college in California. I think it's the UCLA. And it's, according to surveys, 4.6% of the overall US population has self-reported a suicide attempt, with that number climbing between 10 and 20% for lesbian, gay, or bisexual respondents. By comparison, 41% of trans or gender nonconforming people surveyed have attempted suicide. Beyond the overall number of suicide attempts, the rates are consistently high from the respondents ages 18 to 65. When they begin to recede, trans men are the most impacted, with 46% reporting an attempt in their lifetime. Trans women are close behind at 42%, and female-assigned cross-dressers report rates of 44%. So that's almost 1 in 2, transgender or gender nonconforming people.
So wait, what do you mean by female-assigned cross-dressers?
That's what the Huffington Post and Williams Institute reported. I'm not sure what they mean by that. I think that's what they're saying by cross-dressers who present themselves as feminine.
Like drag.
Right, exactly. And then this is the rate of transgender and gender nonconforming suicide by race and ethnicity. So the highest is 56% American Indian or Alaska Native, and then second to that is 54% multiracial or mixed race ethnicity. Black or African American, 45%, Hispanic or Latino, 44%, Asian or Pacific Islander, 39%, and white, 38%. And that's from the Williams Institute. And then this was a quote I found by Ora Bigato, part of the Anti-Lord Project. Being transgender means one is more likely to suffer poverty, homelessness, and criminalization. The violence carried out upon trans and gender nonconforming people lowers their life expectancy. But for those who do not make it to middle age, there's little in the way of resources for housing, employment, and healthcare. So when you're not receiving healthcare as a transgender, gender nonconforming person, you're also not getting care for your mental stability and therapy and things like that. I know there was a recent ban on, Adrian, what's it called? It's the therapy that tries to make you go back to being your gender assigned.
Conversion therapy.
Conversion therapy, thank you.
Yeah, they're calling for a ban on conversion therapy.
Right, yeah. And then that's just a picture of a homeless shelter for transgender people. Let's see. And then I have another thing to read. Healthcare for transgender people remains highly stigmatized and largely unavailable for the majority of trans people, both private, which would be your employer, and public, which would be Medicaid. And let's see here. Does anyone have anything to say about that? Any comments on that?
There's also, sorry.
Oh no, go for it.
There's also a stigma like when you're transgender or gender non-conforming, non-binary, any of that. When you do go to get healthcare, there's a certain stigma of whether or not like basically it feels like the doctor is judging you
Right.
the entire time. They might misgender you. They might call you by the wrong name. You know, they might treat you differently if they know.
Exactly, and I think that's why a lot of them don't even seek help to begin with.
Yes, and not just that, but it's just really uncomfortable.
Right.
In general.
Yeah, you don't know if they have their own personal agenda towards what you're going through.
Yeah.
And their own ways of helping, you know.
Exactly.
So, and I'm going to talk about that later at the end. Also, I wanted to be clear, I'm not going to talk about good treatment versus bad treatment. I mean, obviously that's a form of bad treatment, but what I mean by that is I'm not going to say, you know, these pills aren't good for you, pills are good for you. I don't really take a stance on that at all. But I think it's important to question it and bring it up, so we'll go over that. The next thing I wanted to go over was substance abuse, and the U.S. has the highest rate of that, which is funny because, or ironic because we have the strictest drug laws here. The World Health Organization survey of legal and illegal drug use in 17 countries, including the Netherlands and other countries with less stringent drug laws, shows Americans reported the highest level of cocaine and marijuana use. For example, Americans were 4 times more likely to report using cocaine in their lifetime than the next closest country, New Zealand, 16% versus 4%. In contrast, in Netherlands, which has more liberal drug policies than the U.S., only 1.9% of people reported cocaine use and 19.8% reported marijuana use. And again, I'm not making a commentary on drugs use at all. I'm just pointing out that the U.S. has the highest rate of abuse of it. And then the rats will make sense in a second. So I found this passage, and it was written by John Harry, who wrote Does Capitalism Drive Drug Addiction? And I was going to read the whole thing, but it's kind of long, so I'll just kind of summarize it. So basically, in the 70s, they did this study where they put rats, and they said, oh, well, if we put heroin in one of their water bottles and just left the other water bottle just normal water, which one would they choose the most? And obviously, the rats chose the heroin bottle. And then this guy named Bruce comes along and says, well, hang on a second, you're putting these rats in a cage with nothing for them to do. So what he did was he made a place called Ratland, and where rats could have a bunch of friends and they could party, and they have lots of cheese, lots of wheels, and it's just basically called Rat World with a bunch of stuff to do. And then he says that none of them actually use the heroin water bottle. They actually just go for the regular water bottle. And this is what he said word for word. No, don't. Okay. Let me see. So what he says, I'll tell you about in a minute, but what Bruce says is that it shows that both the right-wing and left-wing theories of addiction are wrong. So the right-wing theory is that it's a moral failing. You're a hedonist, you party too hard. The left-wing theory is it takes you over, your brain is hijacked. Bruce says it's not your morality, it's not your brain, it's your cage. Addiction is largely an adaptation to your environment. We've created a society where significant numbers of our fellow citizens, and sorry, my computer's wigging out, cannot bear to be present in their lives without being drugged. Let's see. We've created a hyper-consumerist, hyper-individualist, my computer's wigging out, I'm sorry, isolated world that is, for a lot of people, much more like the first cage. Then it is like the bonded, connected cages that we need. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And our whole society, the engine of our society, is geared towards making us connect with things. If you're not a good consumer, capitalist citizen, if you're spending your time bonding with people around you, not buying stuff, in fact, we are trained from a very young age to focus our hopes and dreams and our ambitions on the things we cannot buy and consume. And drug addiction is a really subset of that. So I just thought that was an interesting take on drug use, that it wasn't, oh, the chemicals in your brain make you more attracted to it. It's not that you are not a moral person. It's just really the cage you're in. And then the next point I have is alienation, which Karl Marx, is kind of the expert on that. And he says, the worker feels only outside of work, and during work he is outside himself. He is at home when he is not working, and when he is working, he is not at home. His work, therefore, is not voluntarily, but forced labor. It is not the satisfaction of a need, but only a means to satisfy other needs. Its alien character is obvious from the fact that as soon as no physical or other pressure exists, labor is avoided like the plague. Finally, the external nature of work for the worker appears in the fact that it is not his own, but another person's, that in work he does not belong to himself, but to someone else. It is the loss of his own self. Does anyone have anything to say about that?
Makes sense.
I agree with it. It's true. I mean, how many of the people in this room would actually go to their jobs every day if they didn't have to?
Right.
Depending on your job and depending on how much you actually like what you do, sometimes we do things that we don't like because we need to in order to survive.
Exactly. Greg.
Well, and this is the funny thing is every single job I've had, including intellectual labor, teaching philosophy and ethics, I hated, and I realized that I was only doing it to get a paycheck. Like, who in this room can honestly say that they've ever felt good about the work that they've done, which is a new phenomenon for me, and it's not all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But like the satisfaction I get from working for a nonprofit, building things with my hands, despite whatever philosophical intentions I may have, is the only satisfaction I've ever had in work. Mm-hmm. And I just wonder if anyone else in this room has ever had a real sense of satisfaction from any job they've ever done.
Jessica had her hand up.
My job now, I mean, it's still work some days, I'm like, oh, I don't want to go, I have to be there a certain amount of hours. But I definitely feel satisfaction, even from the moment that I walk into the room. And I'm in childcare, I teach kids, and they're happy to see me, they want to be there. So it's really based on like a lot of like connections that I'm able to make in work, and work with certain kids on, just seeing their growth and see them learning and growing and developing skills that they haven't had before, and that's pretty satisfying to be a part of that.
Adrian.
2 years ago, I worked at an organic, vegan, gluten-free restaurant, and I'd say it was my favorite job that I ever had. It's the only job I've ever had where I was actually happy, that I actually felt like I was doing something with my life instead of just, making money for big capital. It was a health food restaurant. I was serving people things that were actually good for them. I was promoting a lifestyle that needs to be more promoted. I was doing something that corresponded with my values. Everybody there was intelligent, and they wanted to do something other than just pay bills and die. All the customers were decent people. Even the food off the assholes that came in sometimes were decent people. It's a huge contrast from when I did fast food. Like I said, that is the only time I've ever been happy working. I'm actually really reluctant to get a job right now.
Awesome.
I can honestly say that myself. After working nonprofit work and venture and aid relief and stuff like that, where I wasn't getting paid for it at all, to go from that to earning a wage was like, I felt like I was losing part of my soul.
Yeah, doesn't compare, right?
I'll be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sad when you realize you'd rather work for free knowing you're doing something worthwhile than to, work for a bunch of people that are just going to slave grab you.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
I thought too, lately I've been trying to gain income through doing freelance work
Right.
rather than working for somebody else, because saying that can tend to be very miserable. But that brings with it a whole lot of other challenges, especially when you don't have a company's back you to support you with healthcare and things like that. You kind of just are off on your own little world.
Right.
And it makes it that much harder to kind of stay stable and mentally stable.
Exactly. Jacob.
I think in specific relationship to your presentation, I think that alienation produces a sort of reaction to it, a general malaise, which can create all sorts of compensations. Like, for instance, I'm sure we've all heard the joke, oh, you don't like your job? Well, they have a pub for that. They meet at the bar.
Yeah.
That's its club.
Yeah.
For instance, like people like overeat.
Right.
Because, for instance, they're working too long.
Exactly.
And they don't have enough time, so it causes all sorts of health issues. It causes depression because you really aren't doing anything in your life. I mean, if we were looking at a sort of gross psychological sense,
Right.
People do all sorts of things that are mentally unhealthy for themselves. Like, say, for instance, what sort of creativity do people have because they sit down and watch TV for 8 hours a day? I mean, they're entertained, of course, but that's a compensation for the fact that they're just exhausted.
Right, exactly. No, I think you bring up a really good point, and it made me think of something, but I totally lost it. But coming from my own experience, when I worked at the bank, I was working the bank when I first joined this group, but that was rough because I got in trouble a lot of the times for trying to help people. I wanted to work there so I could help people approve loans to people who normally wouldn't qualify, and I reversed a lot of fees on people's accounts, but I was always hit really hard on that. And it just, and then when they try to push the sales aspect to get people to buy things they don't need or apply for interest rates I knew they couldn't afford, it really messed with my psyche. So I knew like I had to get out of there, and I actually put in my 2 weeks before I had anything lined up. But we'll get to that later. But yeah, any more comments on that?
Just one kind of an initiative, kind of funny, made me laugh a bit. Like thinking about it, I saw the example of a capitalist worker as like a hamster on the wheel of a cage,
Right.
just perpetuating the motion, not really going anywhere, but they're just trying to entertain themselves in some way.
Right, exactly. Going back to my rat example, good for you, Will, you were listening. In the framework of private property, labor is the alienation of life. Since I work in order to live, in order to procure for myself and the means of life, my labor is not life. In the framework of private property, my individuality has been alienated to the point where I loathe this activity. It is torture for me. It is in fact no more than the appearance of activity, and for that reason is only a forced labor imposed on me, not through an inner necessity, but through an external arbitrary need. You say it. No, not me. Speak to the microphone. No. But I, going back to what we said, I'm really happy to hear that Jessica's able to find something where, yeah, you still wake up, you're like, it's 8 a.m., I don't want to be here, but she feels like she's doing something really great for the world, and I think that's awesome. I think a lot of people don't do enough to find something like that, or just kind of get content with, or not content, but complacent with where they are. And, people will always say, well, if you don't like your job, then leave it. But it's not easy in this world. And I think that's a really problematic way of looking at it. Karl Marx just talks a lot about how we lose our humanity, and we just alienate from our own selves, which is really scary and can really mess up your psyche. So I thought, yeah, Kanan.
Well, just kind of feeding off of this, I joke a lot, right, that like after the revolution's done and everything's settled out and all this has been burned to the ground, I'll probably still be baking cakes because it is something I enjoy.
Yeah.
I really enjoy it. It's rewarding work for me. It's honestly, very relaxing. It's something I like, but at the same time, knowing that I kind of have to do it in order to have a roof over my head, to have food to eat, to be able to get to my job, or the fact that all of my other means of existing, my sheer existence relies on the fact that I show up at this place and make these cakes. I can enjoy doing it and I can be satisfied in that labor, sure, but if at any point I decide I want to do something else, well, then that's shitty for me, right? Because now that means my connection to living, my connection to eating, my connection to getting around places is severed. Like,
Exactly.
it very much, that last, it's kind of a long sentence, but it is that last sentence there kind of drives that point home. It's, not because you're exactly wanting to do it. No matter how much you like your job, you're not doing it because you want to do it. Even though some of us may feel rewarded for doing it, we're doing it because it's like, well, shit, if I don't do it, I'm going to starve to death in a box. Like,
Exactly.
That's going to not be what I want to do with my life.
The motivation starvation, basically.
Yeah.
And like you said, like I'm a freelance artist too, well, except the fact that I'm not producing art because I go to work and I'm so exhausted after that. And I'm like, well, why should I produce art if I'm never going to make money off of that? And I try to stop myself and think, well, that's really shitty. Like, I love it, but I'm just so exhausted from working all the time. And you kind of just disconnect with stuff you previously loved, and I don't know. You just look for the point. Yeah.
Yeah, when I hear a lot of examples that people give, I don't think that in its connection to what Mark is pointing out, that it's a matter of just feeling unhappy with your work or not
Right.
getting a lot of enjoyment from your work.
Right.
I think it's actually like a sort of, especially American, but all over liberal idea that you should get a job that you really sincerely enjoy.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, gardening and stuff like that for yourself, right, in which you're not really producing something to create capital, might be hard, but in the end it might feel satisfactory.
Yeah.
And there might even be work that's shitty that you don't like for instance, gardening, or like producing food for yourself and your family that doesn't alienate you.
Yeah, exactly.
I think the point is about alienation itself is that it drives this sort of, if you will, sort of mental compensations or disorders as a result of alienation itself, not just merely not liking your job.
Exactly. It's basically what I'm producing and what I'm doing constantly. I may enjoy the activity of it, but it's not satisfying any of my needs. Like you said, can you say something about gardening, Michelle? She just started a garden at her house, and it's really hard, but she brings home the bacon for all of us, tomatoes.
For bacon.
Yeah.
Totally fine.
No. Yeah, plant bacon. Yeah, but no, I think it's awesome. Like Michelle and her own little world is an example of that. She's not making money. I mean, you could argue she's maybe saving money, but it's not about money. I mean, she enjoys doing it. She does it on her days off, and she come home, she's all sweaty, but she has dinner on the table for me. She's awesome. Anyways, sorry about that, everyone. And then another point I have, which I think is huge, is consumerism. It's something we talk about. A lot of these things we talk about in a communist text, but I'm just trying to bring it home where it's personal, where you look at it every day in your own life instead of just like, oh, there's consumerism out there. It's like, nope, right here in your head. And then this is where I'm going to start quoting Taekwon. So just a short intro to Taekwon. Taekwon was a series of journals in France in 1999 where a bunch of situationists, post-situationists, anarchists basically got together and made these journals about consumerism. And they kept it anonymous because they were afraid for their lives. But yes, and I just think situationism can have a good take on the situation, which is why they call themselves that. Just the personal situation and society we're around. So first things this person says is, at the beginnings of the 1920s, capitalism realized that it could no longer maintain itself as exploitation of human labor if it did not also colonize everything that beyond the strict sphere of production. Faced with a challenge from socialism, capital too would have to socialize. It had to create its own culture, its own leisure, medicine, urbanism, sentimental education, and its own mores, as well as disposition toward their perpetual renewal. So basically, I mean, I want to hear what you guys had to say about that. But to me, that's basically they had to colonize every aspect of you in order for it to thrive. Instead of it just being successful at marketing, even though that's part of it, it had to make itself basically not look like capitalism for it to work. Does anyone have any? Yeah.
It definitely consumerism has definitely become a culture. It's in every aspect
Yeah.
of our lives. You know, the clothes on our back that we cover ourselves with. You have to have this pair of jeans. You have to have these shoes.
Mm-hmm.
To the food we eat. You know, you have to go to eat. You have to go to this restaurant. You have to go to this restaurant. You have to buy this milk. You have to have this, this, and this in your house. You have to have this kind of car. You have to wear this kind of makeup, this kind of whatever.
Exactly.
This kind of haircut.
Or even like surgery is a big thing too.
Yeah, they literally make money off of anything and everything that you can imagine. Like you said, surgery is one of those things. You have to have this implant. Your face has to look like this when you're 50.
Which, yeah, it's not, for me, I'm not going to make a comment about surgery is bad, but I understand where you're coming from. It's like, but it's becoming a need instead of just someone's own personal choice. Yeah.
What I would say, though, is it's less about maybe a need, because, for instance, Cubans can get gender reassignment surgery.
Right.
The point is, don't make profits on it.
Exactly. That's true. That's a good point.
So I guess I'm going against the grain here. I don't agree with this. I don't think that's true. I think, in fact, capitalism is much cruder than we give it credit for. And
Right.
ironically, I think it's the intellectualization of capital and capitalism that makes us think that capitalism is sophisticated. What this brother said is true. Why do I go to my job? Is it because I want to buy, do I want to have this Tyler Durden moment where it's like, you're not, you fucking khakis. No, I just don't want to end up starving to death in a box.
Right.
And when I raise my voice, it's not some abstract social force that tries to silence me. And I know, and all of you know, because you've all been there, it's the cops. It's the truncheon. The power of capitalism, I don't think, is as sophisticated as being characterized here. I think at the end of the day, it relies on brute starvation and brute violence. And so, and I'm willing to be unpopular and be alone in that, but it's the cop, it's the soldier.
But don't you think if that was the image, if capitalism looked like that, it wouldn't be as appealing? Yeah, no, go.
So sorry,
Go.
Just to piggyback off that and back right up a little bit, like this is, I think, one way to look at like maybe capitalism as having a survival instinct, but I think, and then this is at the risk of sounding like overly economical, I think really that's what it is it's you make this stuff. Well, how are you going to sell the stuff?
Mm-hmm.
You don't convince people that they need the stuff, that they're making stuff that you're giving them money for so that they can.
That's true. Yeah.
It's, kind of that really basic profit incentive kind of thinking. It's like, well, we made the thing, now we need to sell it so that we can make money off of
Right.
it. And how do we do that? By telling people they need it. And some of that's simple. People need food. People need a house. But then for some people, it's like, well, we spend all of this time making this huge car with whatever. Well, how are we going to justify, then flipping it back to the people that just made it for,
Exactly.
an extra $5,000?
Right.
Well, we tell them we need it. We tell them it's better. We tell them it's, it reinforces a lot of this stuff. I think I just see it in a more, it's Greg's word, I see it in a more crude and simple, dumb way. I don't know.
Yeah, and then Nick. Yeah, you and then Nick.
I think that this may be true because they were writing in France, right?
Right.
I think in the first world, the third world, there's different things going on. It's possible
True.
to say that in America or France, this is what the French schools were.
That's a good point.
They were analyzing, the way that capitalism did itself, and the way that capitalism tried to use the spectacle or whatever to
Right.
around its essential nature. I think that did sort of happen in the first world. There's a lot of money spent on advertising, and not silly offended, pharmaceuticals.
Right, exactly.
But in the third world, during the time we were trying to school and the situation is all the way down to the 90s, it was a very different thing. It was sort of like the Greg was saying, just no advertising, no attempt to overwhelm people with the spectacle. They were going to be overwhelmed with like the police and
That's a good point.
And seeing people who stood up be slaughtered.
Yeah.
So I think there's like advertising is very expensive, and keeping the social peace in there is very expensive.
Right.
And you can only justify it in certain kind of small areas that are strategically important things. It can't work everywhere. And I think it may have been more prevalent in France than the US, but the rest of the world didn't. They had the land choose starvation and so
Socialism, poverty.
Right.
I think there's some value to the situationist view. In that, well, I think everyone, or at least most people, do participate because of the brutal realities there is up front that the ruling class race put on, and most people seem to buy into it. Like 4 years, everyone collectively forgets that, like, whoever we vote in is going to shit all over us.
Like, yeah, like,
And
oh,
so
Bernie
keep
Sanders.
participating. Yeah, whether it's Bernie or Hillary, whatever the fuck, it's just like, yeah, I think most people realize they are participating in the labor market because they have to. But also, there's a lot of aspects of our psyche that I think are taking over.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, in relationship between like medicine and this sort of colonization of every part, I think it might be valuable to contribute and perhaps synthesize what some people are saying in a sort of antagonism of like power over right, is the fact that capitalism needs to reproduce the person, right? It's not merely just producing capital, it's producing the person. In order to reproduce a person, several things need to happen, and what it eventually ends up doing is commodifying every
Exactly.
single social relationship. Right. So like, for instance, prior to capitalism, it would be weird to think about whether or not women should be compensated financially for raising children, right? And the reason why this is bringing into the financial sphere is the social relationship of capitalism itself. The regulation of life and the reproduction of workers is a part of that. And the neuroses and the sort of pathologies that people will develop, right? Which that whole language of reproducing is something that actually produced itself with liberalism, with capitalism itself, sort of evolves. Because what it has to be is it has to be power over life.
Exactly.
Like every aspect of it. And one of these is like the regulation. A really good example is like, for instance, how capitalist medicine works different from socialist medicine.
Yeah.
Capitalist medicine is primarily interested in restoring your functionality, to reproduce yourself,
right,
to make you functional for a system.
Or pacify you to back into the system.
Right. I mean, it's like, are you going to be able to do all these things, which, you know, in the end kind of have capitalist goals, but not totally, but it's to reproduce the social relationship,
right,
get you back up to that, get you back to work, make you functional in terms of raising your children and all these other things, which people subsume as their own goals in order to be able to cooperate in a capitalist.
Exactly. But yeah, to the person it has to make sense for it to continue to work. And they have to be colonized into it, and mentally, for it to be able to work.
But I think this is the point, is we're not colonized into it, which is the problem. Who wants to get drunk right now? Who wants to get high right now? Who thinks that their life is going in the right direction? Who doesn't feel anxiety about the world that you live in and the way it responds to you?
But wouldn't you argue that sometimes we don't know why?
Oh yeah, see, that's the thing is, the fact that we don't know why is unimportant, because this is the truth of ideology, both the traditional Marxian ideology and the cynical ideology. The Marxian ideology is, as Marx said, we do it, but we don't know we do it. Okay, maybe there's a giant capitalist culture, but where does it exist? It exists in New York. It exists in LA. It doesn't exist for us.
More specifically, it certainly doesn't exist, right, for the people in this room, right? So what happens is there's a formation reaction to the various capitalist system that we ultimately know, and I disagree with you, you know, it's the Sakai thing, I'm not big on it, is that we have to form a way of coping, and we have to form a way of coping not because we bought into the capitalist ideology, but if I think about the world and how it makes me feel, and blown up fucking Palestinian kids, and gunned down black kids, and I just thought about that all the time, and I had nothing to cope. No whiskey, no drugs, no whatever ideology I can tell myself. No, ironically, if I had to look at that and I couldn't even have depression, right? And I couldn't be like, I live in a fucked up world and this is a fucked up place, but you know, whatever, that's kind of like how it goes. Maybe I'll watch some depressing movies or some shit. Like, I could not function in this world. And I think that most of the people in this room couldn't function in this world.
Right.
Without not the capitalist culture. Like, it's going great for Paris Hilton. You know, and all of the celebrities who are going to rehab, when they go to rehab, they don't go to the first off, we don't go to rehab because we don't have money for it. But second is, they don't go for the same reasons we do. We go because, like, life is so unbearable, even in the first world. Even where, relatively speaking, we're comfortable. I mean, Indian farmers commit suicide every day because they can't feed their families. But I think that, again, this is where I disagree with the statement offered, and again, I know I'm in the minority, is I think there isn't a hegemony of capitalist culture. In fact, it's the emptiness and weakness of capitalist culture that is so pervasive and damaging and disheartening.
I would agree, but I also feel like, in my own personal experience, that I always made excuses for it, that it was in my head and not my cage kind of idea.
I mean, like, I'm going to be honest, like, just on its face, like, as an entire analysis of capitalism, I really disagree with this statement and, like, the way it survived. But at the same time, like, in the context of the presentation, and, like, causing a, you know, like, the way that these kind of things can cause, like, depression and, you know, mental disorders and stuff, I think this is a little bit, you know, for example, like, beauty standards, like,
yeah, we'll get into that.
Or, like, you know, why do you buy foundation? Well, because you gotta look good. Why do you, and there's other reasons too. Like, some people just really love, you know, and that's great, but I mean, like, also, you know, I've had personal conversations with friends that are like, you know, this is, you know, so sad. They're like, I can't find anything good, and I'm gonna look weird. And it's just, and it's like, and it's a depressing thing. And, like, I feel like that's just, like, one thing, and it's probably not a really perfect example. But, you know, when you look at these kinds of things and the way that, like, it creates certain societal standards, people who fit outside that, and I feel like they can feel isolated.
Right.
And I feel like that's, you know, a big thing, especially with, like, you know, gender roles and stuff. I feel like this really presents itself in a really heavy-handed way in, like, you know, capitalist mass culture. I mean, but that being said, I mean, I do agree with a lot of the things said, but, like, you know, I don't feel like this is how capitalism survives. I feel like it definitely survived with a barrel of a gun. But, you know, as far as causing, like, you know, mental problems among people, I feel like this is huge, actually.
Yeah.
Not, you know, not exactly what they said, but that, yeah, that's 100%.
Nice.
I feel like capitalism does create that sense of alienation and the need for, like, coping mechanisms, but then I think it also turns around and sells you those coping mechanisms
Exactly.
as well. So I think it is ingrained in a lot of people. Like, people feel alienated, people feel like, yeah, just that sense of isolation in society and in their communities, and people aren't stupid. Like, they see that, they realize that, they feel that, but then also capitalism turns and tries to sell you all these products or cures or books or whatever it may be to fix that problem as well. And so I feel like in that way, like, I would agree with this statement. I don't know.
I don't necessarily think that this is how it survives, but if you think about it, capitalism is a very voracious ideology. It's a very voracious system. and a lot of the people that follow it are relatively voracious and empty themselves. Anyway, where I was getting at with that is because capitalism is so voracious, this is just one of its many, like this idea is just one of its many ways of, you
Tactics.
know, more, right? You're bored and everywhere you look, there's ads, turn on the TV, and every channel has a commercial, every YouTube video has an ad, every radio station has an ad. There's billboards everywhere, you're just, you know, bombarded with consumerism, right? So it's not, so I guess what I'm trying to say is not necessarily how capitalism supports itself, it's just, it's there. Like, the thing about something that's never satisfied is, you know, you get a person who's never satisfied because they're so empty inside. It doesn't matter if they're full, it doesn't matter if they have enough to eat, they're still gonna reach for extra food because it's fucking there and, you know, it makes them feel good. Exactly.
And this next one I'm not going to really go over because it's basically what we discussed, but you can look at it for a little bit. But an example of exactly what Adrian was talking about kind of leads perfectly into what I was going to talk about. This is where I kind of think capitalism can hide. In the Dove Real Beauty campaign, oh God. So what bothers me most about this is, yes, on the outside it looks like, oh, look, you're trying to show different body types, you're trying to show different women of different orientations, but in itself, what it's still doing is equating a woman's exchange value with beauty. So instead of being like, you know what, women, you don't have to be beautiful, let's stop talking about it, it's saying, it's still kind of, let me read back to this real quickly. It says, women are given women to consume, the young are given the young, and in this formal and narcissistic emancipation, their real liberation is successfully averted. And that's by Jean Tristan and the Consumer Society Myths and Structures. So that's where I kind of feel like it can hide, because Dove also will air commercials of white women who are shaving, but they can't even have leg hair on their legs before they're shaving and it's already shaved. So they act like they're doing something innocent, but really you're supporting the same business that's just trying to look like it's socialized and trying to look like they're just like you. I don't know, does anyone have something to say on that? Yeah.
Well, I have a lot to say about the Adele campaign. I mean, one thing I think is just kind of rephrasing what you said, but I find the whole idea, you know, highly problematic. It's, if you want to look at just like on the face of what the campaign is, all they're doing is treating the system.
Exactly.
They're like, oh yeah, don't worry, like you don't look like all the other models, but like that's okay.
Right.
They're still beautiful. Like women should have more self-esteem, but like how about the fact that women's self-esteem is like, pardon my French, but it's fucking non-existent because these other companies are holding up like impossibly high. First of all, they're telling you the only thing that matters about you is to be beautiful. Like that's the only
exactly.
way kind of works. And
yeah.
then just picks for like, oh, and you know what? It's not just that you're beautiful, you have to be impossibly beautiful. So
yeah.
if you are beautiful, you're like, I'm not beautiful enough, so I'm worthless.
Exactly.
Second one's look at more of optimistic perspective. So the company that does this, you know what else they do? Ad spotting spray ads.
Yeah.
If you like buy into this and you're like, I think this is a great message, I'm going to go out and buy the product because they're supporting women, they're going to turn around and spend it, tell guys, if you spray these chemicals on your armpits, women will tear their underwear up and jump on you, like on the street. Like, that's what this is.
Exactly.
Buy into this, that's what you're supporting.
And I also like what, exactly what you're saying, what Karl Marx says about it in Capital. He says, our youth value may interest men, but it does not belong to us as objects. What does belong to us as objects, however, is our value. Our own intercourse as commodities prove it. We relate to each other merely as exchange values. So it's basically your exchange value. Or they're trying to say, look, exchange value is more diverse. Look at this. But it's like, no, you're still equating it to the same damn thing you've always equated it to. I don't know. And I know it's a really tired argument. Everyone knows that women are treated horribly in the media. Everyone knows women are, you know, that short end of the stick. But when you delve deeper into it, it's kind of unmasking the anti-campaign of that's really just doing the same thing. I don't know.
I think it's really interesting because you say, like, I'm agreeing with you, but you're like, oh, it's such a tired argument. Everybody knows that. Everybody says that all the time.
But maybe they don't.
When did it stop happening?
Yeah.
Everybody says
Well, yeah,
Who's listening? 'Cause
exactly.
that's people in power.
You're right. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if we're supposed to, take that quote seriously, the reason why you can't stop it is you can't stop participating in capital.
Right. You can't opt out of a system that's there.
Right. I mean, it's almost like, and maybe this is a little ham-fisted, but like when you say, well, you're beautiful or whatever, I mean, it can almost be like you're valuable in the sense of use value,
exchange value. Yeah.
Right. I mean,
Exactly.
I get that's a little
No.
crude to say, but I think that's the entire thrust of it. You can't stop participating in like, oh, I'm beautiful. That's basically like giving up on life. Like for instance, one of the examples, well, I mean, in a certain sense, you can't really tune out. Like you'll hear all sorts of things about like how to dress during an interview and like, how ugly people are excluded. This would be like a good example of like, well, where's your cachet to like get the good job? And so, it's not merely just a social aspect, it's how it is marketable for yourself, because you reproduce yourself as a commodity, an object.
And that's what the book I was quoting, Preliminary Materials for the Theory of the Young Girl, talks all about self-commoditization, exchange value of people, and it's really interesting.
So, I appreciate the point Alyssa brought up, because she brought up the obvious nature of finance, right? What Dove does, they're owned by Unilever, I think is the parent corporation. So yeah, they buy Dove, they buy Axe body spray, they buy whatever, all these things, and all the money goes in one direction.
Mm-hmm.
But, when you think of, this is why I think this is more an issue of patriarchy rather than just capitalism.
Right.
The reason the Marx quote is important is because the way we relate to each other as exchange values is I exchange my labor power for a wage. Now, what's unique about labor as a commodity is, well, it's something that produces value. So, I mean, in the relation of exchanges here, though, what creates value or what value is created, and more so what surplus values or profit is made, I guess.
Exactly.
That's kind of, I don't know.
I agree.
Are you asking that as a question?
Sure.
So again, to me, it seems like it's the reproduction of life, right? You don't actually like exchange your beauty for money or reproduce that. You must reproduce yourself, and that's a part of the whole system. And it becomes an exchange not because you exchange it actively for labor power. What you exchange it for is the potential down the road for labor power. And so it's a part of a whole system.
Yourself is a project, and you labor on yourself.
Like, you could say the same thing for education, right?
Right.
Education, you're not producing an educational commodity unless you're doing it as like sort of a teacher. But when you're being worked on as a student, you are in a certain sense creating yourself as an investment.
Exactly.
Or your parents are
marketable
through the public school to create an investment. And even though it doesn't pay out now, it pays out later. I mean, if you look at the way colleges are done, right? They're, the liberal arts aspect of college is being eliminated, so that way you become good at whether it's a white collar trade or a blue collar trade. That's what you're working on.
Exactly.
Just to be also. Most actual jobs people get out of college happen to be internships where they're unpaid, so they're actually just producing outright. So yeah, you pay money to go to classes, and that's where the money goes, right? It's homogenized in about and distributed as salaries to teachers and pays for school supplies, and is part of that sort of system of things. But the sort of like career analysis of like, well, it's just investing in the future, and maybe it yields some sort of return. Maybe.
I'm not as sophisticated as these guys, but I'm going to give a stab at the question. Soap. Fucking selling soap. That's what they're doing. And you know what? I buy the cheapest goddamn soap and shampoo because well, you can obviously see me. But here's the thing is, the ad campaign does have a social impact, right? Which is like, oh, we're all women together, within a very narrow span of body types. We're all
no, which is hilarious. Well, not hilarious.
A diverse.
No, it's not.
Diversity, right?
No, it's not. Yeah.
But at the end, the bank owns the soap company.
Yeah.
And if the soap company doesn't sell you more expensive soap, then the bank doesn't get its return. So what does the bank want you to do? It wants you to buy more expensive soap. I mean,
whether it's because I'm a real woman and this brand speaks to me, or because, you know, I can literally stop wars. This is a true Axe ad. I can literally stop wars in order to have people have sex with me. Again, I think it's more crude, it's more obvious, it's more base. It's selling us shit. Why? Well, because somebody needs to work in those factories to make the shit. And if they're not selling us the shit, then who has the jobs to buy all the other shit? You know, and so I understand there's, you know, and Marx talks about this, there's the base and there's the superstructure and this is the social relations, right? And the base is our crude economy, and the superstructure are the ideas we have about ourselves and society and marketing and sociology and psychology and law. But again, I think, especially when we're talking about mental illness, it's just like more straightforward, which is who can't afford to choose the kind of soap that they can identify with? Poor people. And where is, you know, the vast majority of untreated mental illness? It's in poor people, because the same thing that excludes them from choosing whether to have Dove or Axe is the same thing that excludes them from choosing to go to a doctor or not.
Right. Ian?
And I obviously don't want to take any words out of Chris's mouth, but like I think that there's a lot to be said actually. This maybe isn't all just like capitalism on its own, and then there's also a lot of patriarchy involved here. Because I could easily imagine a capitalism that, you know, maybe not easily, but you know, like you could think up in a wild imagination like a capitalism might be accepting towards like all forms of identity to still find a way to sell it. I mean, like, you know, we're seeing like expansion of that into like, you know, cis LGBT people, you know, you know, that's very like trans exclusive, you know, with various ad campaigns and stuff. It's like, look, it's okay to be gay now that we say so. So I mean, like you could,
yeah, exactly.
Imagine, like this could expand, but also like it's unlikely that you're going to see like this, you know, liberatory image of women in a Dove campaign or an Axe campaign, when, you know, the people who really run everything are like dudes.
Exactly.
Cis dudes. I guess.
It's a good point.
That's just my
But
example.
Oh, shoot. You weren't supposed to see that yet.
Oh,
Go ahead. Okay. Well, the next thing I was going to go to is just like, again, back to the psyche, how that affects the psyche, is they literally market mental illness. Like, no longer is it a mental illness, it's a fashion statement. And I don't know, I just kind of wanted to bring that up, where not only is what causing you, I mean, my argument isn't that capitalism causes all mental illness, but I feel like subconsciously it doesn't get a lot of credit for doing that. But then it goes back and sells you it. It goes back and sells you it as a fashion statement.
Well, you said you wanted to say that capitalism, or you don't want to blame capitalism for causing mental illness. I disagree with that. Probably, I don't know, ways not to articulate at the moment, but there's a very thin young woman there wearing a t-shirt that says
Right.
"Eat Less."
Exactly. Same company on all these, by the way.
Yeah, anorexia can be found in every country in the entire world.
Right.
The earliest, at least documented cases that would go back to, I think, like 1280. Like, it's a real disease that's naturally occurring. In like this amount of the population, we go to capitalist modern societies and it skyrockets.
Exactly.
The way capitalist doctors and psychiatrists frame it is genes and your biology will be done, and society pulls the trigger.
Exactly.
So you can say, does it cause it? Well, this or that. But the people who are running it are like, oh yeah, if we didn't do this, it might happen, 100 cases as opposed to 10,000.
Right.
Well, then, how much, life we put on it, I think is a great deal.
Yeah, exactly. And that actually, again, alludes exactly what I was going to go into. But no, it's perfect. Like, thanks. In anorexia, we see much more than a fashionable pathology. The desire to free oneself from a body entirely colonized by commodity symbolism to reduce to nothing a physical objectivity that the young girl wholly lacks. It also goes into saying, basically, that the anorexic struggles against feeling enslaved, exploited, and not being permitted to lead a life of their own. They would rather starve than continue a life of accommodation. In this blind search for a sense of identity and selfhood, they would not accept anything that their parents or the world around them has to offer. In what I shall refer to as a genuine or primary anorexia nervosa, the main issue is a struggle for control, for a sense of identity, competence, and effectiveness. And that's from Hildebrand and Eating Disorders, Obesity, Anorexia Nervosa, and the Person Within. So yeah, exactly what we were talking about. Does anyone have anything to say about that? No? Okay. It's not working. Okay. And then I'm going to go into treatment. And this is like the big bang of everything. Hold on. Let me gather my thoughts because this is going to be a doozy. Okay. So first point is basically I'm going to talk about how the mental health industry targeted women. And it says here, hysteria is undoubtedly the first mental disorder attributable, that word, to women, accurately described in the 2nd millennium BC until Freud considered an exclusively female disease. And everyone knows Freud is like really awful. But what I thought was really interesting was this passage I found. So in the 1890s, when Freud was in the dawn of his career, he was struck by how many of his female patients were revealing childhood sexual victimization to him. Freud concluded that the sexual abuse was one of the major causes of emotional disturbances in adult women, and he wrote a brilliant and humane paper called The Etiology of Hysteria. However, rather than receiving acclaim from his colleagues for his groundbreaking insights, Freud was met with scorn. Basically what it goes in to say is that he wrote this amazing book about how when he discovered, or when he was studying his patients, his women patients, he noticed a lot of them were abused and sexually abused, and this was a lot of the causes for what they were going through. And then when he wrote that book and published it, he got so much backlash from his male colleagues that he instead wrote the Oedipus complex, which is where no, actually, women secretly desire it from their parents first.
Oedipus complex?
But yeah, it tells me to pronounce it differently, but you're right. Yeah, exactly. So he basically wrote this book, and then all his male colleagues were like, no, that's hurting us. And so he discounted his own research. And so basically, this contract started a 100-year history in mental health field of blaming victims for their abuse perpetrated on them and outright discrediting of women's and children's reports of mistreatment by men. So I thought that was really interesting. Yeah.
Just for anybody, do you know how hysterics were treated prior to Freud?
Masturbation.
And what's that like?
Yeah, I thought it was sexual treatment or
Some
abstinence.
They can dunk them in ice water. Pinnell's the guy who ran the institution. But yeah, there's several treatments for hysterics.
Or surgical removal of the uterus.
Right.
Yeah, hysteria literally means wandering uterus. Is the etymology of it. Freud sat them down and talked to them, let them actually speak. So like comparing what the treatments were to what Freud developed as psychoanalysis, I don't know. I think it made groundbreaking progress.
I don't know. He says a lot of shitty things about.
So wait, I'm not quite sure what hysteria is, but from what I've heard of it, it's back then they didn't know that females were capable of sexual desire or sexual attraction. They thought that all females were asexual and that they just did it for reproduction or to please their husbands or whatever. And so when females started having these desires, it was called hysteria. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if that's correct.
Can anybody speak to that? That's what I've heard about it.
Alyssa.
I mean, that's a correct answer, but it's there's in certain aspect, but there's a broader scope of it. So basically, I mean, it's now considered a catch-all disease. Basically, any woman who, it was a made-up disease, especially it meant the wandering uterus. So basically, any woman who had any kind of like actual, like a mental disorder, or who had,
A menstrual
anxiety,
period.
stress, or PTSD,
Yeah.
or some sort of, anxiety disorder suffering, or like past abuse that she was suffering. It was like, well, you're a woman and you're not behaving the way you're supposed to be, so
Yeah.
obviously there's something wrong with you. Your uterus must be running around inside of you, and then they would go for some
Right. Yeah.
ridiculous or just straight up barbaric treatment. So I mean, there were cases of it in terms of like sexual urges, or sexual urges without any kind of outreach, or could have been the result of being abuse. Or
Exactly.
Women living under this patriarchal
Yeah.
patriarchal society where they have no voice, and you're you are living in a family where your thoughts are count for nothing. You have no control or say so.
Right.
That tends to kind of mess with people's heads.
Exactly. And the reason why I brought up Freud is because after he found that research, he used this construct to conclude that it says here the episodes of the abuse and the clients had revealed to him had never taken place, and they were simply fantasies of the events the woman had wished for. So they're like experiences of why they were actually suffering is now completely invalidated because the patriarchal society was like, no, like you're gonna make us look bad. So
I mean, you put it really cruelly. It's like,
yeah.
Oh, I was abused by my father. And the psychiatrist is like, you wish.
Exactly. Exactly. And
that's what it was.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it keeps going to slides you shouldn't see. Why? Anyone else on that? The next point I wanted to bring up was how this affected Black people. And I like this quote a lot. It's, "A racist society will give you a racist science." So this is the Crownsville State Hospital. And basically, when this hospital was first being constructed in March 13 of 1911, they were literally put into labor camps to actually build the hospital. So they had these mentally ill people build the hospital themselves for free labor. Yeah, the first 12 patients were doing that. The living conditions were horrible. Let me find something here. Yeah, men were given manual labored work and women had to knit and mend clothing for staff as well as patients. Patients worked as hod carriers and assistants to electricians and plumbers, so they were basically just working for free for them. And in the 1888, an article titled "The Need of an Asylum or Hospital for the Separate Care and Treatment of the Colored Insane of the State" stated 3 reasons for creating the hospital. However, 5 years later, about 400 Blacks were still improperly cared for in dark cells, restrained with chains, and slept on straw. So those were the conditions of this hospital. I mean, I don't really think that's hard to believe when you have separation of education between white and Black children, and the Black children got the short end of the stick. It's going to happen with segregation, obviously. But yeah, I thought that was really interesting. But it still didn't really get much better even up until the 60s. So originally in the 20s and 30s, the stereotype of someone who was schizophrenic was a housewife who was sad and withdrawn and would not do her duties as a housewife, would not do the housework. This was the typical case of schizophrenia. And then in the 60s, something shifted. The actual criteria for schizophrenia shifted, so it changed. A lot of the psychiatrists and hospitals and police were encountering young, angry Black men who were part of the civil rights movement, who were part of the riots, the uprisings, and Black Power movement, who were angry, who were perceiving its conspiracy of power against them. That was called paranoia. They would see it as white privilege, but it was called paranoia. And so we actually see the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia change. So now you have anger and paranoia and hostility being included as criteria, whereas 30 years before they hadn't been, because the stereotype has changed. So there's a way in which the DSM, which is basically the criteria for mental illness, and the perspectives of the psychiatrists and the doctors who were giving these diagnoses is thoroughly politically constructed and thoroughly dependent on the culture and context that they're within.
So this made me have a thought. Who here has heard of oppositional defiant disorder? 1 person? 2 people? 3 people. Damn. Okay. So, oppositional defiant disorder. The reason this made me think of it, and for those of you who don't know, it basically means that you don't listen to authority. Like that's if you want to look up the diagnosis, it basically means you don't listen to authority. And the reason I brought this up is because I'm noticing that back then they wanted to call anything that deviated from their oppressive system a mental disorder.
Right.
To this day, they still do that with things like oppositional defiant disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Does anybody in here have has anybody here been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder? Do you think that you actually have that? Like, do you actually experience the poor executive functioning, or do you think that they just put that on you because you didn't want to listen, or you didn't want to pay attention to school? What do you guys think?
Didn't pay attention.
Didn't pay attention?
I don't pay
I didn't either.
Bye, Cannon.
Bye, Cannon. But you guys see my point, right? Like, and today's system is anybody who challenges the system or who doesn't want to do as they're told is labeled mentally ill. Just like back then. Some people would go as far as to get diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder because they won't do what they're told.
Right.
Which is absolutely crazy because antisocial personality disorder basically means you're a sociopath.
Right. And then, and someone actually wrote his name. Let me get his name. John Mertzel. He wrote The Protest Psychosis, How Schizophrenia Became a Black Disease. And he said that he found his patients were non-threatening. However, schizophrenia was a diagnosis disproportionately applied to the hospital's growing population of African American urban men from Detroit. And then it happened also in Baltimore a lot. So a lot of people, or a lot of black men were called, honestly, it was a scare tactic. Like if you'll see in racist ads like this from the 60s, assaultive and belligerent. So it's basically asking people to look for signs of this, acts promptly to control aggressive assaultive behavior, and they'll just basically this is an ad to scare black men from being angry and rebelling, so that they wouldn't be called schizophrenic and then end up in a mental home that would mistreat them. It's pretty horrible.
Well, just we were talking about race and mental health. I don't know, have anything included about Mania?
About what?
Mania.
Mm-mm. Is that during when Japanese word?
No, Mania was a common diagnosis in the American South during slavery, but it was a mental disease that would make slaves run away. And the most effective cure that we found was to cut off a toe.
Wow.
Cure.
Exactly.
Oh, God.
What I'm trying to prove here is that the reason why a lot of people are so sick is because the medical system it changes with culture. And that's what he's arguing. He's saying at the same time, my evidence shows that even the most scientific diagnostic criteria can reflect social environments in which they produce, a process I discussed through the language of structural or institutional violence. All three authors agree that such a reversal must be governed by a collective political process and not by professionals and experts. The ultimate answer to neurotic dependencies on professionals is mutual self-care. Basically saying the people who say that will help you actually are part of this huge agenda to make you passive and pacify you into your current condition, which is really scary. I think also why a lot of women were scared to emancipate or liberate themselves is because literally a husband could have dropped his wife off at any mental home and said, she's not doing the housework, she's not pleasing me, she's not sexually pleasuring me, basically, and she would either be picked up a year later or never again.
Do you, I want to hear what your thoughts are on this. Do you feel like there's kind of two different stories between oppressed nationalities and mental illness, and like, say, for instance, shootings? Like, when there's a shooter, like in Rhode Island, that's like going to kill all these children in an elementary school, it's something that becomes an issue of medical problems, psychological problems. But when there's somebody else who performs a shooting, and let's just say they're black or something,
They're
like
a terrorist.
Well, but this is the thing, is it's not classified as a psychological disorder, but has some sort of other explanation. And so, do you think that, I mean, is there sort of analysis that you have between, I mean, because this is certainly true. I mean, this is all on record, as we can see clearly here on the slide. But do you think that there's an explanation between this sort of disparity in two sides between oppressed nationalities and mental health versus like everything becoming over or becoming a matter of psychological disorder?
So are you basically asking, is there a psychological reason more behind shooters based on the mental health system rather than them being oppressed, or is that what you're asking?
Well, I mean, to assume that position would be like a psychological realist position, as opposed to, like, say, for instance, analysis of somebody's behavior, right? If a white person does it, it's because they have a disorder. Or if not
exactly.
doing what they want, it's a disorder because we must somehow enable her to do it. As opposed to a black person or whatever, if they're like involved in a shooting, it's always because of something else. It's not because of psychological disorder.
Right, exactly.
Not always. I mean, that's
exactly. Well, I mean, I think there's grounds for it to be researched, because I think it's an individual basis. I don't think there's really a correlation between, I guess you're asking if there's a correlation, but I don't know. I really don't know. Possibly. I mean, I feel like you'd have to evaluate. I mean, obviously we treat them differently. I mean, there's no question that we treat the white shooter different than the black shooter, but I don't know. I don't think we really treat the black person as someone that they did it on a psychological basis, but maybe we should question that more. Maybe it's just the individual. I don't know.
Well, I mean, okay, maybe like a different example of this is like prisons, right? Who gets into prison for what?
Right.
Because, you know, if somebody commits the same crime and they're oppressed nationality, right, it's just attributed to some criminality, not some psychological disorder.
Right. Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, yeah, well, I mean, black people are obviously live in more poverty. When you're in poverty, you're more desperate. So maybe there's grounds for saying that there is a psychological backing behind. If there's a crime more popular in a certain community, it's probably because of the system that they're in, or the system that. Greg?
The white slave owners have always had the fear that we're going to murder them in their bed.
Right.
This is not fundamentally different. It's just the new updated version of it. Which is why if a white person goes crazy and shoots a bunch of people, A, they'll probably be apprehended alive. B, it'll be a mental illness or gun control issue. And C, if we do it, it's because we're a bunch of criminals.
Right.
And need a massive state apparatus, whether it be the cops or the militarization of cops or whatever, to suppress us. I mean, I think that's why, you know, white guy murders a bunch of people in Colorado, and
he's still alive.
He's still alive, and then also it's like, oh, he's crazy.
Right.
But like, black cop who's like, my department's racist, I've reported the racism, they blackballed me, they fired me, so now I'm gonna kill a bunch of cops. It seems very, and for those of you who don't know, just look up like Michael Dorner. Christopher Dorner, sorry. That's, I need war. Star Trek. But no, it's like it's a straightforward political thing. Like, there was an institution, the police department, they destroyed his life, they ruined everything about his career, his ability to make money, and so he released a political manifesto saying, I'm gonna kill a bunch of racist fuckhead cops.
Right.
And then it's like, whoa, this is crazy, man. What are you doing, crazy guy?
Right.
Or like, oh, you just, you know, there's no content behind it. And so whatever delegitimizes the violence seems to be like
the case, right? So like if there's a rational political reason, then it must be because they're crazy, like the angry black men in the 60s. But if it seems nonsensical or is criminal or just like abstract violence, then it always is, you know, because of criminality, grew up in a one-parent household, something, some bullshit.
Right.
We hear all the time.
You'll notice in the instance, though, of like the narrative regarding white shooters, there's an attempt to preserve humanity. No such is given or extended.
Exactly.
Or first nationalities.
Very true.
Again,
Animalistic.
Well, white people don't normally do this.
Right.
There's always black on black crime.
Right. Exactly.
The only slight exception I can think of this is when white people are perceived to have gone over to the other side somehow. Like this guy, this soldier in Idaho, staff sergeant, Bill or something like that. He wrote a journal saying like, this patrol I'm on, these army guys are racist, they promote the worst people, we treat these Afghans like crap, we shouldn't be here, I'm gonna get out of this as soon as I can. And he just like left, he was on patrol and he just like surrendered to the Taliban. And people were like calling for him to be, like first of all they didn't want him to be rescued. They thought that, the army said, well we don't know why he left, we're just gonna rescue him because anything that. So they got him back and people were saying, well you shouldn't have done that. And we should have just like shot him on the battlefield. We shouldn't give him the big Indian court martial. We should do this other stuff because he went over it.
I see.
So it's sort of like this thing, and you have to do a lot, really, as a white person, like get into that.
Yeah.
As a white, there's like you have to literally join the Taliban.
Yeah.
Soldiers are like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, the extenuating circumstance was like several people were killed on certain parties looking for him.
Well, the thing is, even the army was like.
So a few white soldiers were killed in the process.
Right,
So that's why he
that's
was
true,
back in.
Just as a quick addition to that, a really good example of that is the so-called Patty Hearst syndrome, right? She must be ill because there's no way that she would ever have that sort of reaction as a rational person.
Well, there actually was a lot of abuse in that situation, right? Wasn't there like, wasn't she like?
I wasn't sure.
Don't know about that.
At least with photos and all that.
Yeah.
But then he
She is
All right, and this is now this is the most scary part for me, where we get personal. Okay, so this is the Lakeview Bountiful Hospital. It's actually a psych ward that I was in for half a week, and this is where I kind of wanted to bring the whole capitalism's out there. We're all sad, kind of personal and home. So I knew I had depression from when I was like 12. And the first time I sought help, I was in college and I went to the doctor. He said, oh, kind of like awkward, I don't really want to talk about that. I filled out the survey and I was like, okay. So it was like 1 through 6, how sad, or 1 through 10, how sad are you? And I was like, okay, 11, circle. And then he prescribed me basically things, and they made me throw up and my body was reacting horribly to them. And I told him, I said, I can't take this. And he's like, no, this is what you need. This is what you need. And I thought, well, how could you discern that from a number I circled on the survey? And the money, I mean, the medicine was expensive. I was paying $30 a month for this like antidepressant little bottle of pills. And I was like, I can't afford this, and let alone it's making me sick. But he didn't really help me. So I kind of just lost faith in the medical system. And then I got my job at the bank. And I think a lot of the whole alienation I talked about played a part into furthering my depression, and it just got bad, and I felt like I lost my humanity being there. I didn't feel like I was really human. I felt like I was a machine and that they didn't really see me. And not that I wanted my boss to be my friend, but I just wanted to be able to not be scared about losing my job when I was sick. So I attempted suicide January 10th of 2010, or 2015. No, I wasn't 14 when I committed suicide. No, I was, this was this year, in January. And so I was taken to the hospital, and I was kind of waking up, and they were like, why did you do this? And kind of like, there was a cop there, and I was so scared, and I remember just like kind of being restrained to this bed, and I was freaking out, and then I asked, like, what are you gonna do with me? Where am I going? They're like, well, we're taking you, we found a room in Lakeview Bountiful Hospital, you're going there tomorrow. And I was like, do I get to talk to anybody? Do I get to tell anyone that I'm going here? How are people gonna find me? And I was like, do I have a choice in this? I can't afford this. And they're like, no, you don't have a choice. And even if you went there involuntary, we would get a court order for you to go to. So it's all threats, not this is gonna help you. Like, we're worried for your safety, which I just felt like my autonomy was attacked, and I felt like, I didn't know what was going on. So, and then I get to the psych ward, and again, I'm like handcuffed to my ambulance bed as they transport me there in an ambulance. And this is like the next day. And while I'm there, I'm checking in, and they just put you in a room, tell you to take off all your clothes, and then tell you basically what you can and can't have, tell you all the rules. And I was freaking out, and I don't know where it's going with that. And then basically someone came in, and they're like, we need to know, do you prefer male counselors, do you prefer female counselors? Because we ask you that because if you've had trauma with men or trauma with rape or something, we want to accommodate. And I said, yes, I do apply to that. I would love a female counselor. All my counselors were male. And they didn't ever have therapeutic treatment for me. They just kept me in a room and with my roommate, and they kept coming in back and forth, different people, just asking me, what's your birthday? What's your height? What's your weight? Why are you here? What did you try to do? Repeatedly, those same questions. It was never like, oh, we're gonna get you help, or so sorry, we have these resources. It was just question after question to see how insane I was, basically. And so I was freaking out, and I had medicine in my purse that I needed to take every day that they wouldn't allow me to take because they thought it was maybe drugs I was trying to take while I was in there that weren't good for me. But I told them, like, I need this, and they wouldn't let me have it. And all the therapy was completely bogus. It was basically, well, maybe what you do is hurting other people. Maybe how you think is just, it's messed up in your head, and that you need to change. It was never like, oh, I'm so sorry, your reality is horrible, here are some coping mechanisms. So I asked for sleeping medication, and they gave me a sugar pill to make me think it was sleeping medicine because it didn't do anything. And they put me there. It was like there was only me and one girl, one non-binary person, and like 8 other men, and we were all like stuck in this room together constantly. And I just was freaking out. And I made friends with a non-binary person, but they wouldn't let us talk to each other anymore because they didn't want you to develop closeness in that facility. So they separated us. And then when I got out, these men who were in the facility with me started stalking me, and I don't know how they got my information. I don't know if they just didn't keep their files secure, but my information was released. And one of them showed up to my work, and it was really insane. So that was kind of my experience with the medical system. So I just felt, and then not only that, but I come home or I go to work the next day and I start throwing up because I had internal bleeding. But I tried to be at work, and I was like, oh, I have to go home. And they're like, all right, but you might not have a job when you come back. But they put me on probation. And so I went back, and I was just sad because I told them, when I put in my 2 weeks, I told them why. I said, you wrote me up when I was already on the ground and suffering, and that really sucked. And they're like, well, we had these free counseling sessions you could have taken advantage of. I was like, well, that's really nice to not have known before this whole ordeal. But so I left, and I don't know, I just found my own therapeutic process. I lied to them at the hospital. They make you sign up for this outpatient treatment that's totally expensive, but I pretended to commit to it so that they would let me go. And so I tried to tell them that medicine made me sick, and they were acknowledging that. They kept prescribing me stuff, and then I would pretend to take my medicine because I knew, and I would start throwing up, and when I would take my medicine, and they would all of a sudden have a bulimic anorexia session for me. And I tried to tell them that I wasn't bulimic, I wasn't anorexic, I was sick from the medication, and they didn't listen. They said, well, we've heard that plenty of times. And I was like, okay. So when I got out, I found my own therapeutic process, and that's why I'm not really pro-pill or anti-pill, because it's different for everyone. People really need that, and for me, my body just didn't respond well. And then also on the capitalist aspect of it, I came home to a letter in the mail for a $3,000 bill, $1,000 for being in the ambulance for 10 minutes, and the other bill for my stay there that I was forced to. And so that really sucked. But yeah, so that was my experience with the medical system. Does anyone have anything?
I can share a little bit about one of my experiences. I've been admitted twice before I was 19. The first time for suicide was the second time because of an incident at school with another student. And in both experiences, I was for similar processes to some extent in varying degrees, but ultimately afterward, the therapy session in 10 years pretty much of, being told by therapists, you're depressed, you need this, or you're having too much of an obsession on this, and just stop and take this. Well, I had to send out 2 lawsuits when I was living in Illinois towards therapists that I've had in the past because they poisoned me.
Wow.
Or overdosed me to varying degrees on things like Seroquel, paroxetine, or generic Paxil, things like that. So
yeah,
I totally understand what you mean.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to end on such a horrible sad note, but my point is kind of just how this hits home and what we can do to how important the work is we're doing, because we're trying to fight a system that's making people sick in their heads. And then this is the last quote I have by Mark Fisher. Consider mental illness as an individual chemical biological problem has enormous benefits for capitalism. First, it reinforces capitalist drive towards atomistic individualization. You are sick because of your brain chemistry. Second, it provides an enormously lucrative market in which multinational pharmaceutical can peddle their pharmaceuticals. We can cure you with our SSRIs. It goes without saying that all mental illness are neurologically instationed, but this says nothing about our causation. If it is true, for instance, that depression is constituted by low serotonin levels, what still needs to be explained is why particular individuals have low levels of serotonin. This requires a social and political explanation, and the task of repoliticizing mental illness is an urgent one if the left wants to challenge capitalist realism. So, yeah, and cool. Yeah. Oh, raising your hand.